I'm going to take a moment to introduce a cousin of mine. His father and my mother were first cousins. And although that seems to be a great distance over generations, our two families have remained close. His father got his wings in Pensacola in 1939. And he flew dive bombers off the Essex in early World War II. And my cousin, Richard Wilburn, whom I'm going to ask to stand up right over there. Richard's birth certificate reads San Diego County, California, but the city reads North Island. The medical hut became the medical annex, and it had to be, and maybe it became the hospital. It had to be removed when they extended the main runway at North Island. That's our story. We're sticking to it. Welcome to San Diego, Richard. Okay. I just want to mention that masks are optional today. City employees are required to wear the mask. Everyone else, it's optional. You do what you think you need to do. I just like to thank Lyman Green for his special coffee brew today. The Roundtable has been meeting in this room since 1984. And we're growing and growing and growing in the technological world. This is our 8th program where we're combining a Zoom broadcast for our stay-at-home viewers, as well as recording the program for our YouTube and Facebook customers of the library, which will be up later today. Right, Nick? Right. And Nick Burmeister is the library's technical librarian, and he handles all the details, including wiring me up, which wasn't easy today. Thank you, Nick. 3 things for those watching home on Zoom. First, you may wish to mute yourself so that your private conversations are private conversations. Second, you may wish to turn the camera off so that your personal activities don't need to be observed. And third, please use the chat box to ask your questions. We will, first or second question during Q&A will come from a Zoom question. Now, a couple of announcements. Tina Friend, the Coronado city manager, will be our speaker in March. That's the 4th Friday in March, that's the 25th. The 4th Friday in April, the speaker is scheduled to be Thomas Riott, R-E-O-T-T. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. He's the Consul General at the U.S. Embassy in Tijuana. Our May 27th speaker is sitting right over here, at least she was, Jill Olin. There she is, raised her hand, okay. Captain Jill Olin spent 16 months in Afghanistan and addressed the Coronado Roundtable in January of 2021. Since then, times have changed. She will make a presentation in May, and it will greatly include information relating to Afghanistanis in the United States and Afghanistani women here and there. I don't know exactly what she's going to say, but I'll guarantee you it's going to be good. Today's speaker, Admiral Charles Martolio, Vice Admiral, retired, United States Navy. Some of you may be aware that we had another program scheduled for today, and that speaker had to cancel. And Admiral Martolio stepped up late last week and offered to do this program, and we're certainly looking forward to it. Vice Admiral Charles Martolio is a highly regarded advisor on national security, international relations, and strategic leadership. He spent about half of his 40-year military career in the United States Navy at sea in cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, including command of the Ronald Reagan Aircraft Carrier Strike Group. He spent the other half of his career developing strategy and leading military operations, initially for the U.S. Navy and then for all U.S. military forces. I know for a fact that one of his latter assignments was to work with defense forces in Eastern European countries. You know, I bet he covers some of that today. He's a recognized expert in strategic planning, and he continues to be an active contributor to our nation's security, advising and speaking non-politically, that's important, non-politically, on issues impacting America, especially those in Europe and Asia. Additionally, he teaches master level grand strategy and defense policy at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. Admiral Martolio is a 1978 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and he holds a master's degree with highest distinction in national security and strategic studies from the U.S. Naval War College. Charlie is married to the former Darlene Lewandowski of Cleveland, Ohio, a multi-award-winning commercial banker. They are both active in the San Diego community and live here in Coronado. Incidentally, Darlene Martolio also serves for the Coronado Roundtable Board as our treasurer. So let's welcome Admiral Charles Martolio.
Thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm going to try to speak without a microphone. Can everybody hear me okay? If not, I'll grab a microphone. And how about our audience on Zoom? Are they all clicked in and happy? Great. Okay, I'll give that. Let's give it a try. Is this better? No, it's not. Yeah, it is. I can hear it. Is this better? Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. As Kirk said, a discussion like this couldn't be more timely, and it is very, very important because, as the title slide indicates, what's going on in Eastern Europe today obviously has local implications for the nation of Ukraine. It has regional implications for all of Europe. And it does have, as we'll talk about today, global implications well beyond Europe. So this is a very, very timely discussion as we look to why it's occurring, what's occurring, how the nations are interacting with each other at the scene of contact across Europe and across the globe, and then how this plays into the greater security situation being global security and the great power competition. And we're going to try to do all of that in about 50 minutes. Many of you have heard me speak before, so you know that I always like to start with what are the takeaways. If you remember nothing else from what we talk about today, these are the wave tops that I asked you to take away. President Putin exploits from the Russian national psyche this long-standing fear of invasion, and he uses it to stoke nationalism, to try to keep Russia in the forefront of his citizens' minds, and to justify actions external to Russia and internal to Russia. The goals of what he is currently doing in Ukraine: internal regime strength. Anytime you talk about an authoritarian government, first and foremost, it's about preserving their strength internal to their nations. Increased resources, access to increased resources. The security buffer zone that goes along with the Russian culture of invasion fear. He's looking to intimidate the United States as well as the European Union and increase the effect of his voice on the world stage. And time is not in Russia's favor. Putin has a very, very high risk tolerance. We as strategists, as national policymakers, you as citizens, you need to factor that into how you think about national security, because this guy is willing to take chances well beyond the norm in the world of security. And he's always calculating. It does take a strong alliance cohesion to defend against Russia. Probably the single most important factor going into the future is alliance solidarity, alliance strength, and alliance sustainability. Those three components of coalitions, friends, and alliances are absolutely critical in this immediate confrontation, as well as preserving America's position and that of democracies and free markets across time into the future. Make no mistake, China is watching this to see how what Russia is doing either negatively or positively impacts the great power competition and China itself. And Russia is watching China to see if this great strategic alliance that they talk about has any real value in the world. Without question, what is going on right now in Eastern Europe will shape European and global security going forward. This really is a seminal event in national security and international security and in international relations. So if you remember nothing else, if you remember that, we'll be doing well. You know, so many of my slides have a lot of words. Don't get tangled up in the words. A lot of them are meant to have impact. This slide is designed to make a point. This slide is designed to tee up the Russian psyche of fear of invasion. And this fear of invasion builds this desire for a buffer zone outside of core Russia, sometimes referred to as the near periphery. And you can see going all the way back to around the year 1000, there have been invasions of Russia. And then Russia does what they call an active defense, where they'll invade in order to keep an adversary from being able to invade Russia and to establish that buffer zone. So this is a long-standing Russian cultural thought process that President Putin takes advantage of in whipping up nationalism and justifying his actions. This is a culture that is security focused, suspicious of anybody who is not Russian, and that suspicion yields toleration of hardship. I, as a Russian citizen, I am willing to have lesser of a life in order to preserve Russian security. And externally, I, as a Russian, am willing to do things outside of Russia to preserve my security, even if that hurts a little bit. This is Russian culture, Russian history, and this is the Russian mindset that President Putin exploits. Now, it's not quite as black and white as I state on this slide, and I'll talk about how that moderates a little bit in future slides. But the bottom line is, it's a culture of security fears, and the people are willing to tolerate hardship to accommodate those fears. One of the biggest fears of the current population, and that's what you have to put yourself in the mindset of the current citizens in Russia, is the fear that came out of the chaos of the Yeltsin years. As a Russian citizen looks back in their near history, what they're looking at, what they're very concerned about, is what happened when President Yeltsin was in charge of Russia. You know, Gorbachev had left the scene, the Soviet economy had collapsed, the Soviet Union had dissolved, And there was incredible chaos inside of Russia. That's what the average Russian today really fears, is a return to that type of environment. And they look at America and the West as part of the reason why that happened. And they look at America and Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, and they see Eastern Europe doing pretty well, better than Russia. And they say, why is that so? They never like to look internal. They never like to ask what their leaders did to make it so. They never ask, why isn't Russia better integrated into the system that has allowed Eastern Europe to rise economically? But that's the mindset of the average Russian today. So what Putin has been able to do is take nationalism and self-sacrifice, a cornerstone of Russian culture, and use that to motivate his citizens, and in some ways to insulate himself and his government from concerns expressed by his citizens. Bilaterally, between two nations, you see that Putin has established bilateral relations with China, with Syria, with Iran, Venezuela, Egypt, Libya. There has also been multilateral expansion, where groups of nations come together, often because of either Moscow or Beijing. And this is just a list of how Russia, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has built multinational organizations to replace what was part and parcel of the Soviet Union, including the Warsaw Pact. What's going on in Ukraine today really started back in about 2007. That was Russia's cyber attack into Estonia. It wasn't a conventional attack. It was all done in the cyber domain. Followed up shortly thereafter with a conventional attack, a conventional aggression with armed forces into Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. Then, of course, you have Ukraine in 2014, Syria in 2016, a new nuclear strategy in 2020, what they're doing in Libya, what they did in Belarus, and Kazakhstan just before beginning their Ukraine campaign. And I might add a continuous disinformation campaign, not only against the United States, but also against all democracies. And they did write a new national security strategy in 2021, and I'll talk briefly about that as well. So you can see, coming out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has very, very systematically rebuilt international relations with nations that tend to have authoritarian governments and managed economies. So this strategy, this new strategy that came out of Russia in 2021, there's really three parts to it. The first is to return the Russian Federation to world power status. In Putin's mind, that is probably the most important objective. And he's doing that by trying to reestablish a sphere of influence. Nations that are close to him, geographically close to Russia, have to be inside of Russia's sphere of influence. He clearly wants to increase the scope of international respect that his word commands. He's looking to influence or veto international events, international relations, really put his imprimatur on what's going on in the world. And he is absolutely committed to challenging US leadership across the globe, returning the Russian Federation to world power status. He is also looking to strengthen political and social stability. Political stability is his internal power inside of Russia, his ability to control things inside of Russia. Social stability is his ability to crush any sort of movement against him or dislike or voiced opposition to what he is doing. Social stability has a fiscal component, so he's trying to make Russia stronger fiscally. If you look over about the last 8 years or so, really since 2014, he has pretty successfully, in an economy that has undergone limited sanctions, put together a pretty good war chest for what he's doing right now. Internal controls. How does he control the people so that they don't get a critical mass to challenge his authority? You've seen this in the last 24 hours as some local protests inside of Russia were very, very quickly put down. And then a crusade of self-sufficiency. Again, this idea that he knows he's treading against some international relationship bedrocks, and he knows there's going to be a price for that. So what does he have to do to make Russia self-sufficient so that he can continue to have a functioning nation? And the third priority, which I've intentionally grayed out, is what does he do to try to improve the quality of life for his people? These are all his words in his strategy: paychecks and pensions, healthcare, opportunity, and consumable availability. And why did I gray that out? I grayed that out intentionally, not as a political statement about Russia, but the reality is, with the way that their economy is constrained, it's really difficult to fund all three of those. And guess which two objectives are receiving funding? Not the grayed out one. So if those are Putin's objectives, I want to focus on the near periphery, that sphere of influence, because that's what Ukraine is all about. You know, a strategy, in a strategy, you talk about ends, ways, and means. Ends are the objectives. Ways are how you achieve the objectives. And means are the resources you use to pay for the ways to achieve your objectives. So the three objectives we've talked about, the ways that Putin is using his assets to achieve those objectives in the near periphery to establish that sphere of influence. And on the right-hand side, I indicate sort of in the order of kind of expected from Russia, tolerated, all the way to the red towards the bottom of the slide, those things that he is doing that try to influence nations on his periphery to be subservient to his desires and Russia's wishes. From propaganda to organized crime in other societies, to intentionally corrupting other nations' officials, to weaponizing energy dependence. You know, this is a big deal you read about in the press right now about Europe's dependency on Russian gas. In particular, Germany, which gets about 35 to 40% of its energy from Russia. Covert operations, intelligence agencies running operations behind European lines, Russian intelligence agencies running operations inside of Europe. Bolstering military posture, bringing forces to the western edge of the Soviet or of Russia and saying it's for training, and then establishing camps. So, I mean, you can see how they've worked through this list here to now where they're conducting an active military campaign in a sovereign nation against an elected government. That's the Ukraine piece. But what else are they doing? They're also vocally talking about threatening activity against Europe, the US, and Asian allies. Anybody that interferes with what they are doing in Ukraine, President Putin is threatening. This is a pretty dangerous guy and a dangerous situation. Ends, ways, and means. Follow the money. Russia is fourth in defense spending behind US, China, and India. Their main constraint is their industrial capacity. What are they actually capable of producing? No surprise, Ukraine has an enormous industrial capacity, as well as an agricultural capacity. Most of Russia's money that goes into security goes into high-end systems. Things like unmanned and autonomous vehicles, nuclear delivery systems, hypersonics, very, very fast missile systems, directed energy, and cyber. And I key on cyber because it has a multitude of uses beyond some of the stuff that you read in the press. I've tried to list them here. Everything from election tampering and influencing protests in places like Europe and America, to trying to build a deterrent capability, cyber attacks, breaking apart alliances. And the thing about cyber is, compared to some of these other things, it is dirt cheap. So even nations that have a financial squeeze like Russia can afford phenomenal cyber capabilities, and they are very sophisticated in cyber. The takeaway from the means, the resources portion of this discussion is what Putin is doing right now is sustainable at his discretion. And I say he is constrained because the Russian economy, although you read it's one of the largest in the world, it's about $1.6 trillion per year gross domestic product. That comes out somewhere around 10th largest in the world. So he is constrained, but not contained. In other words, he can do a lot of the stuff that he's doing, and he can spend his money like this, but there's not a lot more to go around. Many of you know that Putin engineered a constitutional change inside of Russia that allows him to remain in power through about 2036, if he so chooses to do so. So what are Putin's policies for life? The first, of course, is pressurizing Russia's near abroad. He's been doing this since 2007. You've seen how he's worked his way around the periphery with various forms of pressurization. On that ways slide that I showed you how he pressurizes the near abroad. And through co-option, intimidation, continuous destabilization, he looks to build this sphere of influence either by getting cooperative leaders occupying the nation or annexing the nation, making the nation part of Russia. He's looking to continue the strategic partnership with China for now, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. He does focus his military resources on the high end that we talked about: cyber, hypersonics, advanced nuclear delivery systems. He will always generate and exploit cleaves in any sort of American-led, democratic-oriented, free market economy associations, coalitions, or friendships. He supports authoritarian regimes, both he and President Xi in China. He is looking to build relations in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arctic. He wants the influence and the resources that come along with influence and the ability to generate activity in those regions. And it's a hedging strategy. It's a plan B in case things with China don't go particularly well over the longer term. He'll capitalize on any opportunity to present America and Europe a fait accompli. In other words, Russia, am going to do something like Crimea, and if you don't like it, now you got to come and throw me out. It's a fait accompli. Little bit of what he's doing in Ukraine. It's not quite a fait accompli, but it still has a little bit of that tone to it. But if Putin, who has a very high risk tolerance, senses an opportunity to present a fait accompli that will weaken America, weaken Europe, weaken the coalition, weaken relations in Asia, he will take it. And look for opportunities to weaken America's position in the world. The bottom line of his new strategy is he wants to strengthen Russia to be an independent, co-equal great power, subservient to no nation. Think about what that means. Does that mean that he's willing to subordinate Russia to China? Does not mean that at all, right? And that's a pretty bold statement coming out of Moscow. I want to be an influential international actor on the world stage, beholding to no one, self-sufficient, and subordinate to no nation. That's the Putin that we're confronting today. But all is not great in Putin land. He does have some pretty significant challenges. And remember earlier when I said time is not on Putin's side. He's got some political issues. He knows that. Rising popular discontent, especially among the younger people. And people know there's a better life out there, a better life than what they're seeing in Russia. One of the reasons why there is this destabilizing influence across the world today is information is ubiquitous. Everybody knows what everybody else knows. You know, before 20, 40, 60 years ago, you could live a good life. I could live a good life. You maybe not so much, but you didn't know how I was living. Now you do. And nations and populations, they don't want to wait a generation or two to achieve that standard of living. Even the great Chinese patience Not so much. They know, large swaths of the Chinese population know how the rest of the world is living, and they know they are not there, and they're not content to wait a generation or two or three. And we see that in Russia. We see regions becoming insubordinate because of the rise of the oligarchs, those that have phenomenal wealth that are able to carve out independence unto themselves, rampant corruption, economic challenges. Again, constrained but not contained. I don't want to oversell Russia's economic challenges because they are in the top 10 or 11 in the world in terms of the size of their economies. But anytime that there's an issue with the economy, the traditional Russian response is to balance the economy on the backs of the people. But remember, I said the people are willing to tolerate hardship when you're telling me that I've got a security problem on my front doorstep. And that's what's playing out right now. Flight capital, Russian money leaving Russia, going elsewhere. Energy production, their number one and really their chief export. What's going on with energy today? One is shift to green. Two, although the prices are currently going a little bit higher, Russian technology for extracting oil is inferior to the global standard, and it is not getting any better, and it will get worse. Because since 2014, oil technology has been sanctioned. And that's the lifeblood of their economy. You can see some of the other economic considerations. Military conflicts, this nationalism that Ukraine has whipped up does bring the Russian people together. It's part of their culture. But what's dangerous about nationalism, I've talked about this to this group before. What's dangerous about nationalism is you got to keep feeding it. Because as soon as I stop feeding it, you become less nationalistic, less likely to support me. And so this is a very dangerous treadmill for governments to get on, to use nationalism to gel their people together. It's really easy to whip up. It's very, very hard to back down. And the demographic issue. When it was the Soviet Union's population was roughly about the same as the United States, about 280 million people. The day the Soviet Union dissolved, that population went to about 160, 165 million, because all those other nations fell away from the demographic base of Russia. The population's been in a decline since then for a whole variety of reasons. And it's going to get even smaller by 2050. The demographers think to about 133 million people by 2050. Birth rate, brain drain, they're going to have an inverted social pyramid. There aren't enough people to be productive, to generate gross domestic product. All of this is causing President Putin long-term problems. And he knows this. But what's a fix to this? How about going into a country like Ukraine, which I said has a fairly sophisticated technology base, a fairly sophisticated population of about 40 million people, and Belarus, another 10 million, not nearly as sophisticated. So right away, I can add 50 million people to my demographic base, and technology and resources and the ability to pad my future a little bit so that it's not quite as dark as this slide shows. So we talk about getting influence. We talk about improving Russia's position on the world stage. We talk about his legacy, Putin's legacy. It's also about resources, because Putin knows that the clock is ticking, and it's not ticking favorably to Russia. But this sort of activity, assuming it works, a potentially dangerous assumption for Putin. If it works, it buys him time, because it makes up for political shortfalls, economic shortfalls, and security shortfalls. So what do the Russian people think? How has this played into what Putin's doing? From 2012 to about 2020, the Russian people were pretty aligned with Putin, because they saw him delivering stability. Remember, in the back of the generation that's influencing things in Russia right now, not the oligarchs, but the kind of the middle class, is this Yeltsin chaos years. And they see Putin delivering stability and delivering a sense of national pride after feeling kicked around on the world stage for so long. And they do think, as I mentioned earlier, of democracy and reform associated with the Yeltsin years, which they don't want to go back to. And they do see the former Soviet republics doing better than they are. Why wasn't Russia assisted? And they don't look to take any of that blame unto themselves. They just look to blame America, Europe, and democracies. 20 to 21, nationalism still resonated. People were still proud of where Russia was and what Putin had done. But that ubiquitous information that I talked about said, or made the people say, I want more. I know there's a better life out there. Patience is wearing thin on economic prosperity, increasing resentment of the systemic corruption that underpins Russia. Older people were beginning to protest. Younger people were just leaving. And if you had resources and intellectual capital, you left. Why? Because opportunities were better outside of Russia. And Russia started following the China model for internal control, repressing their people. So things started to look a little bit dicier. I don't want to say dicey. I don't want to oversell this. But all of a sudden, Putin looks out and says, I got to do something on this nationalism front, because the people and their content is beginning to fray. And so, since the people's perceptions were changing not in Putin's favor, he decided to go with another shot of nationalism, Ukraine, and more authoritarianism, greater crackdown on the people. It's kind of like a dual track approach to controlling your population. You suppress them, you surveil them, you put internal security forces in place, and then you motivate them to support Russia and the government. So why Ukraine and why now? It's a continuation of the pressurization campaign that's been going on since 2007 that we've already talked about. He is looking to rebuild that buffer zone of Soviet times, that Central Asia soft underbelly, as well as the western portion of Russia, the eastern portion of Europe. Absolutely, a strategic objective is to degrade the transatlantic alliance and alliance unity. Specifically, decouple the US from Europe by breaking NATO and then breaking the EU apart, the European Union. Because the reality about Europe is, without a function that brings people together like NATO or the EU, Europe is just a bunch of small nations that can't stand up to a big nation like Russia. You need the European Union, you need NATO if, in fact, Europe is to remain whole and free. Very much an objective to discredit democracy. Look how much more efficient authoritarianism is at achieving our objectives. I say go, and we go. There is no debate, there is no discord. The Congress or the Parliament doesn't disagree with me. There aren't protests in the street. Democracy doesn't work according to Putin. He sees that need to stoke nationalism because the population was beginning to say, there's something better out there and I'm not seeing it yet. This is a big one. You know, as President Putin and President Xi look to America and America's allies, this really is happening. The ability of America to pull the democracies together and to pull the free market nations together. And as I'll show you in one of the slides towards the end, that puts a huge amount of power in those national governments. The ability to influence nations like China and Russia. If we act together and have coalition unity, strength, and sustainability. That is a critical component of all of our security across the coming decades. Some tactical considerations. Hey, Europe needs gas right now because it's cold, COVID, and Putin is testing his relationship with China. How foursquare is China going to stand behind me as I do this act, which the rest of the world thinks is reprehensible? I don't care that they think it's reprehensible, but is China going to support me? Are they going to live up to this great strategic alliance that we talk about? It's a test for China from the Russian perspective. So let's look at where Ukraine can go. You know, in strategy, in particular in grand strategy, you talk about alternate futures. Alternate futures are, as you look out 5, 10, 15 years, what might the future look like? And alternate futures are very discreetly defined variations of what the future might look like. But I can actually say, if this is the alternate future I'm talking about, I can define that pretty well. If this is the future I'm talking about, I can define that pretty well. So Ukraine's alternate futures relative to Russia, arrayed across the bottom, you can see them on the left side of the slide as well, all the way from Russia withdrawing forces to NATO attacked. Everything in between, and you can see them listed there on the left-hand side of the slide, are the alternate futures that Ukraine may face, NATO may face, and may impact global security from Russia. And then what I've tried to do is kind of chart their likelihood of occurring based on what the alternate future is, and you come up with a likely range of futures. And that likely range of futures, 2 months ago, people were saying Russia's doing this because they want to continuously destabilize Ukraine, keep it unstable. Another range inside the range of alternate futures was to occupy the separatist regions in eastern Ukraine, for the Russians to occupy those regions that had already declared their independence from Ukraine. And in fact, there was a line of control between Ukrainian forces and the separatists, all the way to a full-scale invasion. Those were the three inside the range of likely futures until the full-scale invasion occurred. And what I've tried to show here is that this whole bell curve has shifted to the right, meaning what we're seeing is NATO being threatened, not threatened in absolute black and white terms. I'm going to come and invade NATO. I, Putin, am going to come in and invade you. But veiled threats. Don't do things in Ukraine or you will face catastrophic consequences, the likes of which you have never seen. And so what we're seeing is this range of futures play out pretty much as people thought it would, except more to the right, more to the dangerous side, because Putin has a higher risk level and is willing to exploit opportunities where he sees it. And so this, Ukraine and Russia, will be a defining event that shapes European and global security for the foreseeable future. So what is NATO doing about it? And when I say NATO, I include the United States in that because the United States is the key part of NATO. In Eastern Europe, building a credible deterrence presence in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe. Deterrence, the right capabilities, in the right capacity, at the right level of readiness, in the right position, and the national will to use those forces if deterrence fails. Because NATO is a sovereign commitment for the United States. Why we're not fighting in Ukraine is because Ukraine is not part of NATO. But the Baltics are, Poland is, Romania is, Hungary is, Slovakia is. And if they get attacked by Russia, and Putin knows this, that red line for NATO, even in Putin's mind, is a very, very high bar. But if we don't deter and make that bar high, or if NATO does not achieve unity, or if NATO demonstrates weakness, Putin, who has a high risk tolerance, will take advantage of that to recreate the former Soviet Union, perhaps in the Baltics, perhaps in Poland, perhaps in Hungary, perhaps in Slovakia. Again, with this idea of a defensive mindset, building that buffer. I can tell you a very, very good story about why I'm behaving so badly. And I'll say it enough times and maybe you'll believe it, even if I'm lying. That's the Putin mindset. Disinformation, trying to confuse adversaries, trying to cleave adversaries. And of course, we got to think about more than Eastern Europe, because this is all of Europe as well as the Atlantic. That is part of NATO's responsibility. And so this idea of continuous diplomacy never stops. Strengthening deterrence. Easy words to say. What's the hard part about strengthening deterrence? It takes money. It takes resources. You can't just say, I'm going to strengthen deterrence in Eastern Europe and think that Putin's going to believe you, any more than we believe when Putin says something, we look for the observables. What are the observables? What are you really doing to increase your deterrent capability? And this isn't going to be over in a week. This is now part of a new normal in the security world, and it is a long duration competition that is part of the great power competition. China and Russia's strategic alliance. Yes, there are places they are cooperating. It is a marriage of convenience more than a strategic alliance. And that convenience is based on their dislike of America and democracies. And we do see increased economic cooperation, mostly oil and energy from Russia to China. And we do see some of the other things there, growing bilateral military exercise, Russia giving China access to some of their high-tech military equipment. We see Russia employing the Chinese model for population and citizen control. But look at the list on the right side of the slide. This suspicion between the two nations. China's big strategic outreach on which they're basing their economic future, their shift from an internal debt-fueled infrastructure investment to being able to do things on a global scale. Their strategic initiative is called Belt and Road. Belt and Road goes right through the Russian near periphery. So you have a nation economic allegiance beholding to, say, China, and their security allegiance beholding to Russia, a nation whose economy is not as strong as China, and Russia wants some of that. There is bound, and there will be, and there already is, suspicion in that portion of the Chinese Belt and Road. There are 1.6 Russians for every square kilometer of Russia's Far East. 1.6 Russians in every square kilometer of Russia's Far East. There are about 400 million Chinese just across the border from Russia's Far East. Russia supports India and Vietnam. To say China does not is an understatement. China is having border skirmishes with India, and China and Vietnam are not even close to being friends. And China supports Pakistan, the arch adversary of India, that Russia supports. Russia's hedging activity in the Middle East. Where does China get most of its oil? The Middle East. They don't want Russia mucking in their oil reserves. China is stealing technology and hacking and doing all of the things that they do to us. They're also doing it to Russia. And Russia knows this. Russia is suspicious of their growing dependence on China. So the banner at the bottom of the slide, near term, there is this confluence of interests. Mid and long term, much less certain. And I kind of go back to the Russian security strategy that said, I want to be a powerful, independent, beholden to no one nation. Neither side fully trusts the other, and they both know this. China and Ukraine. I think you're going to see this play out pretty significantly over the next week or so. China is likely to limit their support to verbal backing for Russia, voting with Russia at the UN, but they may abstain from that vote because of the hostilities. They're not going to vote against Russia. But in the Security Council, what is the power of the PERM 5? Any one of the nations out of the PERM 5 can veto a resolution. So Russia can veto the resolution all by itself. Be interesting to see where China comes down on this. At best, they will abstain. At worst, they will vote with Russia. We will see China support global events that don't directly impact Ukraine. For example, naval groups at sea comprised of Chinese and Russian vessels in the Pacific. But you're not going to see Chinese naval vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're going to view issues through a Taiwan lens. How good is America's leadership in pulling together allies and friends? Who else is participating? And how is the solidarity in the coalition opposing Russia? Is it just kind of a hand wave? Hey, we don't like this, don't do it again? Or are there real actions being taken to hurt Russia? Remember now, we're not, when it comes to Ukraine, we're no longer deterring Russia. Russia is going to take Ukraine. Now we're into the penalty phase. What's the penalty that we're imposing on Russia for doing what they did? How much capacity does America and the democracies have to be able to deter and fight and win if deterrence fails? Because that's what really credibly underpins deterrence. If we have to do it in Europe and we have to do it in Asia. And you can see some other things. China has an awful lot of pipelines that run through that near periphery of Russia, in that soft underbelly. If Russia decides to do things in that soft underbelly, it will impact China. China has about $1 billion of investment in Ukraine. Oh, they're very interested in protecting that investment. China is looking to cement Russia to China as a junior partner. Russia, I don't think it's a very good idea for you to do this. Russia did it anyway. That was never a public statement by the Chinese. Perhaps it was said in private between the two leaders, but China's lack of supporting what Russia has done, even verbally, even today, China is talking about the need for peaceful resolution. That's very, very different than supporting what Russia has done. Because what Russia is doing in Ukraine is not in China's interests. unless it's a huge strategic victory for Russia because NATO falls apart, America proves it can't lead, there's not enough resources to go ahead and build a security base to deter Russia and China simultaneously. China looks at Russia and Ukraine based on the impact they assess it will have on the great power competition and on China's economy and ability to develop. Coming to the end here, folks. What are the wild cards that are out there? Probably the top of the list right now is the personal safety of the Ukrainian president, the Ukrainian president's family, and the Ukrainian government as Russian forces close in on the Ukrainian capital. How effective will the Ukrainian military or militia or guerrilla forces be over the longer term in imposing a penalty on Russia for going into their sovereign country? Remember, these are the wild cards. We really don't know the answer to these yet. Is Russia going to turn off oil to Europe? What are the cyber attacks beyond Ukraine going to look like? And are there other triggering events as we go forward? Can nations that are beholden to Russia either for energy or because they have authoritarian leadership, can they be counted on to stay inside the coalition? Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Turkey in particular. Happy to say right now, the answer is all four are solidly in the coalition, very solidly in the coalition. What impact are Ukrainian refugees going to have on Europe? How's China going to play out their non-intervention policy? This is what we're just talking about with China. China is very unhappy that they find themselves in this position. Very unhappy. North Korea and Iran's response. Will Russia escalate? And then beyond Ukraine, my biggest concern is a miscalculation, mistakes, or misplaced initiative. Either at the leader level on the part of President Putin, or at the on-scene commander level, two mid-level commanding officers back themselves into positions from which the only way out is a firefight, and then that begins to snowball. And how this plays out will impact the outcome of the great power competition. So, what does the globe look like in roughly 2030? Well, again, you look at the alternate futures that may be out there. Everything from anarchy and isolation on one end to a global hegemon, somebody wins and everybody's subordinate to them, or some form of supranational governance, a UN that all nations take direction from. Well, you can also see how the bell curve plots out there. And what's the range of likely futures? Some sort of multipolar world where there are 3 or maybe 4 powerful poles, kind of a China-centric pole, an America-centric pole, a Russia-centric pole, and maybe a Europe-centric pole if it's not entirely attached to America and America is not entirely attached to Europe. So 3 or 4 different poles. A bipolar world, authoritarian nations versus democracies. state-sponsored capitalists versus free marketeers. That's probably the world that we're heading towards. And we have been heading in that direction for about 3 or 4 years now. In part because of what President Xi in China is doing relative to trying to build self-sufficiency, decouple from any sort of need on America or Western technology or unreliable contacts. So we were already heading in this direction before Ukraine. So in Xi's calculus, he's going to say, if Putin wins this, not Ukraine, Putin's going to take Ukraine. If Putin wins the larger strategic battle for the cohesion of the democracies, this bipolar world will accelerate. Doesn't necessarily mean war, because you can decouple without war. But it does mean 2 sets of technology, 2 sets of ideologies, and not a whole lot of discussion between them. And then a little bit rosier scenario, also in the range of likely futures, is some sort of limited globalization where nations kind of come back together and work together because they know that doing otherwise may not generate enough profitability, stability, and increase the risk of bad things happening. And so they kind of submerge some of those lesser priorities to get back to some form of limited globalization. Perhaps the world looks at Russia, Ukraine, and says, we can't allow that to go on. We must stand up for democracy, for free markets. We must all stick together. And we'll see what China does. Is China willing to do something that helps the security and stability by probably not castigating Russia, but not throwing their lot in with Russia? If that's the case, perhaps, if that's the case, perhaps this idea of limited globalization will actually increase over time. But it does mean, as a prerequisite, the nations that are democracies and free markets, those coalitions must stay together, grow stronger, speak with one voice, and be sustainable across time. Because if the opposition senses a weakness, they'll exploit it. So we finish up where we started out. And what I've tried to do is to give you a little bit of background and a little bit of basis for why I make these takeaway assertions. This is an incredibly pivotal time for America, for democracies, for free markets, for Europe. That coalition piece, I'm going to leave you with one example of why it's so important. You know, I think we all realize that in the end, so much comes down to money, to resources. When you look at America and America's allies, America, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. Those are our treaty allies. And you combine their economies, the total gross domestic product is about $50 trillion a year. It's actually more than that, but a conservative number is $50 trillion a year. If you look at the Chinese economy and the Russian economy and combine their GDP, gross domestic product, the summation of goods and services, their GDP is about, their combined GDP is about $19 trillion. In a world where the economic element of national power, economic, diplomatic, military, informational, in a world where most of us agree that the economic element is the most important element of national power, who's going to win that competition if the coalition sticks together? Doesn't mean we have to think as one, do as one, but there are certain core issues that are clearly in everyone's interest that leaders need to stand up and say, I'm going to do the right thing regardless of the internal politics involved. That's what leaders do. And that is so important to America, to democracy, to free markets, and to being able to ensure that we turn over a greater quality of life to our children, and they have an opportunity to turn over an equally good or better quality of life to their children. And I'm going to stop now, and I think what we'll do is I'm going to turn it over to Kirk, and he'll tell you how long the break's going to be.
How about a loud round of applause for Admiral Martolio? What a great program. All right, this is a large crowd. Just a second. Your question? All right. Coffee break. Let's try to make it 7 or 8 minutes. Then we'll